me for my voice, but I have never seen anything like it.
Do you believe in miracles? Yes! Unbelievable.
Hey, welcome to the podcast. It's a very interesting one for you guys. Because we're all in quarantine, I thought I'd give you guys a different take on basketball. Because there's no games, it's time to make some lists. Feels like early July where there's only baseball going on. It's list time. So, what I did, let me give you a little background. A year ago, I said, let's figure out who the best players of the decade are. Only 9 years in, but I thought I'd get a jump on it. But how do we decide who the best players are? Well, we have a game played every February, most Februaries, to decide who the best players in the league are. It's the All-Star game. So I thought the only stipulation should be, if you make an All-Star game, you're on the list. To this point, we're starting the 2010-2011 season to Wednesday, when all games got canceled. Who are the best players between those 2 points? Because I'm under the impression that we're probably not going to get a lot of basketball until either August or September. And at that point, do we really even want to come back to revisit the list? We'll probably will. But my point is that we're going to rank the players who were the best players of this decade. 83 individual players made the list. 83 different guys made an All-Star game between point A and point B. So what I did is I compiled the stats. Who had the best points per game? Who had the most rebounds? Who had the best true shooting percentage? I wrote them all down, put them in an Excel spreadsheet like one does, and I figured out who would go where. So today we're going to do the first bit of the list. We're going to do the first 16 guys. We're going to give you rankings 83 to 67. Who was the 83rd best player, and why are some of these guys lower or higher on the list? So without further ado, here you go. Here is the best players of the 2010s. Coming in at 83, the last player on the list, but the first player in our hearts. He made the Hall of Fame. That's how long ago this guy played. He only played one season in this decade, put up 10 points per game and 5.5 rebounds. Didn't make the playoffs that year. Didn't have a ton of stats. Only played a handful of games because due to injury. Played 1 year in this decade, made one All-Star game. He is loved internationally, and he's one of the best centers to play of the last decade. It's Yao Ming. 83 coming in on this list, didn't make the playoffs, and what we really were looking at when we made this list, a number that really stood out to me was the win shares and the value over replacement. And Yao Ming came in last in all of those categories because he didn't play enough games. He still made the All-Star game because he was loved internationally, because he was loved by the fans in Houston, and I'm not taking anything away. He's a Hall of Famer. But he was 83rd on this list. Without much to do, I thought that he was one of the better players of the last decade, and when we get into that, potentially next week, when we do the best players of the 2000s, we'll give Yao Ming a little bit more love. But this decade, Yao Ming was the worst All-Star to make the list. Number 2, 82nd on the list. He played 3 seasons this decade, got bounced around. He had a really good ending of the last decade, but didn't really find a foothold in this one. He was young when he came in the league, and when he left the league, he was still kind of young. 14 points per game with 9.7 rebounds. Had a very good playoffs, averaged a double-double in the playoffs with 15 and 10. Only made one All-Star game as well, but had a pretty good win share to Andrew Bynum. Now, Andrew Bynum has a very interesting spot on this list because his career kind of took off as quickly as it ended. And there's a handful of guys on this list who, due to injury, due to unforeseen circumstances, fell further down the list than probably a lot of people expected. Andrew Bynum, of course, is going to be remembered for those 2 titles that he won with the Lakers in 2009 and 2010. But you have to remember that those fall into last decade. This decade starts with the Lakers trying to three-peat, and Andrew Bynum being the center for those teams. He quickly was traded from the Lakers to the 76ers in that Dwight Howard deal, where he didn't play any games for the 76ers due to knee injuries. And then he had foot injuries, and then he had knee injuries. And he got bounced around the league and never really found a holding spot after his knees completely gave out. Now, for what I'm told, you go online, you can read a bunch of really cool stories about Andrew Bynum. You can read a bunch of really cool stories about his bowling, about what he does for the communities that he's in, how he's still loved in L.A. But on this list, he comes in 82nd, playing 3 seasons in this decade. At 81, we have a sharpshooter. He played every year in this decade. He got bounced around. He was on a really good Atlanta Hawks team, a team that had all 5 starters make the All-Star game. A guy who played with Allen Iverson, was on a really weird Cavs team, was a sharpshooter, and in a league full of three-point shooters, kind of was in the revolutionary stages. Before there was a Steph Curry, there was a Ray Allen. Before there was a Klay Thompson, there was a Kyle Korver, who comes in 81st on this list. He played 10 seasons in this decade, but didn't average double digits, 9.6 points, 2.9 rebounds per game, 1.8 assists. His playoff averages, kind of similar, 8 points per game. Never really had much of an impact. Made one All-Star game, but his true shooting percentage really makes him stand out. 6.24 or 62.4%. He was on that Atlanta Hawks team in 2015 that a lot of people thought was going to come out of the Eastern Conference. Of course, nobody expected LeBron to go supernova again. So he was one of those guys who makes an All-Star game. Was he really that impactful on the league? Is he really going to be a guy that I think people remember? Is he a dude that kids in Sacramento, kids in Seattle who have posters of him? Probably not. But he still made the list. He's 81st. He's going to be one of those guys that, again, we're going to remember him for being a trailblazer of the threes. We're going to remember him being a guy who was an everyday role player, but an all-star was just once. 80 on the list. The league went small right when his peak hit, and then he kind of was out of the league as quickly as he was in it. He made 7 seasons in the league, averaged 10 points per game and 6 rebounds. He signed a really weird contract with the Lakers at one point, which didn't make a ton of sense, but he was on one of those teams that really pushed LeBron and the Miami Heat. He made 2 All-Star games and is going to be remembered as another casualty to the small ball era. It's Roy Hibbert. Roy Hibbert was a guy who had a really weird, this is my Roy Hibbert memory. He had a really weird piece written about him in Sports Illustrated where they compared him to Tim Duncan. And they were saying that Tim Duncan and him played video games together, hung out in the offseason, trained together. But unlike Duncan, who was able to fight off Father Time, tooth and nail, and really make an impact in the last decade, and then again make an impact in this decade, Hibbert didn't have that longevity, didn't have that staying power. The minute that the league went small, him and the next guy on the list really struggled. They could never find a foothold. They never really found their place. He played for the Lakers for a time, played for the Hornets for a time, but he never got back to those peaks he had with the Indiana Pacers. And his memory that I think we'll have, unlike the other guys on this list who don't really have a defining moment, don't have a moment that you think about this player in his prime and it immediately clicks with you, Roy Hibbert's click moment, his apex, was blocking Carmelo Anthony at the rim in the 2014 NBA playoffs, essentially ending Carmelo's playoff career and the Knicks' playoff chances. That is the thing that I think I'm going to remember most from Roy Hibbert. He was a guy who, if LeBron wasn't on the Heat, the Pacers have 2 titles. You can't argue it any other way. I think they were the best team in the Eastern Conference 2 of the 4 years LeBron was in Miami. So that said, I think Roy Hibbert has a pretty adequate place on this list. He made an All-Star game thanks to some of the teammates around him. Paul George, George Hill, David West, all guys who were better than him, I think, in his prime. But Hibbert, again, a guy who any other league, any other decade, I think has an impact for the entirety. In this decade, he played 7 seasons and kind of got phased out. Next guy on the list won a title with the Dynastic Warriors before they became the Dynastic Warriors. He was a guy who played the beginning of last decade with the New York Knicks, goes to the Warriors, and I think before there was the killer lineup, before there was the Hampton Five, there was David Lee, starting in the traditional power forward role next to Andrew Bogut. Now, the minute that he came off the court and they put Draymond Green in, and they were able to sub Andre Iguodala in, and the Warriors played small ball, the league was never the same. So David Lee gets a ring, goes to an all-star game with the Warriors, but another one of those guys of the small ball era really left behind. He never really found a spot on any other roster. He played for the Spurs for a minute when they won 67 games, but ended up getting knocked out in the second round of the 2016 NBA playoffs. He's a guy that I think history will remember most for his younger days when he played for the Knicks, when he got in a little bit of a scuffle with the Warriors in one of the most iconic moments of New York Knicks mid-2000s basketball, I think. David Lee, another interesting case in the small ball era, where he benefited from Clay and Steph and Draymond winning a ring. He doesn't go in the halls as guys like Yao Ming, Kyle Korver, or Roy Hibbert, below him on the list, who don't have a ring. He gets to retire a champion, but he also is a victim of the same system that won him a ring. Next on the list, a guy who came in the league and immediately had a lot of pressure put on him, playing in one of the biggest markets in the NBA, came in playing in a time that everybody needed him to be a superstar immediately, but it's taken him a while to get to that point. He got traded in a blockbuster deal that brought Anthony Davis to the Lakers, and he just made an All-Star game this season. 78 on the list is Brandon Ingram. Ingram comes in the league as a guy who we thought was going to be the next Kevin Durant. And it's happened to guys like Grant Hill. It's happened to guys like Jabari Parker. It's happened to guys like Andrew Wiggins, who come in the league with high expectations. We expect them to be the next big thing. And it's taken Ingram a minute to get to that point. And that's fine. He's a young guy. He played 1 year at Duke. He is a dude who is going to get there. You can see the sparks of it right now. Lonzo and him figured it out in NOLA before Zion got there. I think Ingram needs to be on his own team. I think Ingram, when he's by himself in a role like Devin Booker, in a role like Karl-Anthony Towns in Minnesota, I think he can flourish. I think he needs his own team. I think he needs to figure it out on his own. But for the time being, he's stuck in another situation with the Pelicans where he's going to be the third wheel, where he's not going to get the shots that he needs. He's not going to get the time that it's going to take. He's a dude that needs to take a lot of shots, needs to get his points. He's averaged 16 points per game this decade. He's never had any playoff success, never made the playoffs since coming in the league. He's a dude whose offensive win share is kind of abysmal. I think that in the next decade, he's going to be a dude that we're not going to remember. But in this decade, he's a guy who barely made the list at 78. Next on the list, famous father. He got dealt in a trade that brought Paul George to Oklahoma City. And he's a guy who, again, makes this list making one All-Star game this decade. He's a younger guy, so we're going to give him a pass, but I don't know what impact he's going to have going forward. It's Sabonis. Baby Sabonis was a guy who was a throwaway piece in the Paul George trade. It was a Paul George trade that brought Oklahoma City what they thought was going to be their small forward for the future, pairing next to Russell Westbrook after KD leaves, and they gave away Victor Oladipo, who won a Most Improved Player, and Sabonis, who's turned into a very solid role player for him. But, again, a guy who makes one All-Star game, he makes this list, so we have to rank him at some point. I think that he's better than the guys left on this list because he's proven to me, at least, that he's versatile, that he can play multiple positions, and that he's going to be a very good role player going forward. But is he an All-Star in the next 5 years? It's going to be tough to say. The East has a lot of good young players. The NBA has a bunch of good young players. And Sabonis might get lost in the mix. But for the time being, 4 seasons in this decade, I think that he's going to be a guy who we're going to remember most from this decade as another piece that Oklahoma City gave away to bring a player who left them in the end. Next on this list, a guy who made an All-Star game for the first time this year, but already has proven to me that he's impactful and has already shown me that he is a perfect player next to another all-star on this list, it's Bam Adebayo. Adebayo, from day one this season, has been impactful. Has done things that I didn't expect him to do. Has been a guy who, 2 years ago, if you asked me who this guy was, I'd say he's a really cool name, but I don't know what his power is in this league. I don't know where he's going to be in 5 years. I don't know if he'll be with the team that drafted him or he'll be with the team in the G League. But man, oh man, has he shown to me that he is a guy who can fit in this league. He's athletic, he's long, he can play a position in the top of the key that passes the ball around. Jimmy Butler really can move around freely. Guys like Duncan Robinson can get open thanks to his playmaking. He is he is the prototypical big man going forward in this league. And I've said this to my friends, and I've said this before, that if Bam continues to get better, he's going to be the best big man in the league. Joel Embiid is always injured. Nikola Jokic is one McFlurry away from being way too overweight. And, if Bam proves this to me when the playoffs finally start, whatever they do, if he can show me that he is a dynastic player, if he's a guy that can be a cornerstone player for the Miami Heat, he fits everything you look for in a big man. I really like him going forward. He's number 76 on this list. Next on this list, a guy who had his best years in the past decade, who was going to be on a super team, but it just kind of all fell apart. He was a guy who didn't make much of an impact, to be completely honest with you. The one time that he did make a finals appearance, it's Deron Williams. Deron Williams was almost unplayable in the finals with the Cavs, so much so that you forgot that he was on that 2018 finals team. He was a dude who was supposed to be the point guard, the engine for that Brooklyn Nets team with KG and Paul Pierce and Joe Johnson and Brook Lopez that was going to make some big moves happen. But played 7 years this decade, never really found a way to continue the hype, continue the powers that he had in the past decade. He was in that same conversation. People forget, he was in that same conversation with Chris Paul when we talk about who was the best point guard in the league. That was the type of conversation we were having about Deron Williams. But his career fell off almost as quickly as anybody else's. I want to say him and Roy Hibbert are in the same conversation as players who we thought were going to be cornerstone players that we were going to see for the next 5 to 10 years, and like that, they disappeared. 16 points per game, 7 assists per game, a guy who could run an offense, but in 2020, when you need somebody that can shoot well, you need somebody that can handle the ball and play off ball, Deron Williams never proved that he could do that. 75 on the list. Next up, a guy who got booed on draft night. A dude who was going to be the next great NBA player in New York. A guy who, now playing next to Luka Doncic, might be something. But because of injuries, because he never had any playoff success, and because the rest of these guys on this list ahead of him have had some sort of playoff success or some sort of longevity or proven a little bit that they can do something outside of dunk and block shots and stay on the court, Kristaps Porzingis. Now, Porzingis at 74 on this list kind of feels low. But if you went around and you asked fans right now what role Kristaps plays in the NBA, he wasn't an all-star this year. He hasn't made an all-star with the Mavs yet. He didn't play last year. This year he's played a handful of games due to injuries. I need him to stay on the court. If he can stay on the court, he could be a very good player. He'll probably break the top 50 next decade if he can stay on the court, and especially if the Mavs have success. People thought that this Luka and Kristaps deal was going to be the next iteration of Nash and Dirk. I think that Kristaps has gotten a lot of Dirk Nowitzki comparisons. I like Kristaps' mobility a lot more than I think Dirk ever had. I think that his ability to move around and rotate on defense is better than Dirk ever was. But unlike Dirk, Kristaps cannot stay on the court. He's had the ACL injury, had the weird rehab for that, ankle injuries. He's 7'3". He needs to find either a better trainer, a better diet, or a better way to stay on the court because he hasn't been able to show it to me yet. 18 points per game with 7.5 about rebounds per game. Another player who has very limited to no playoff success. He's a guy with 2 All-Star game appearances and a VORP of 13. Not great. He sits now at 74 on the list. At 73 on the list, the point guard in the same conversation with Kyle Korver, a guy who makes this list one time. He plays every season this decade. He goes to Minnesota, and I think people thought that was going to be the thing that Karl-Anthony Towns needed. It wasn't. Jeff Teague. When we look at that 2015 Atlanta Hawks team, it's going to be an interesting rewatch. It's going to be an interesting look back through this telescope. Because were they great? Were they a good team? Sure. They had all the pieces to be an excellent team. But the problem is that the lack of playoff success, the ability not to get past LeBron, and then not only that, but also just completely fall off the next year and not make it back to the conference finals and have such a short window, that one season that they really had before they got rid of Budenholzer. Guys like Kyle Korver and Jeff Teague are going to get lost to the history books. He played 10 seasons this decade, so every year this decade, and he's the lowest guy. Well, Kyle Korver's the lowest guy, but he's one of the lowest guys on the list, averaging double figures. He averaged 13.5 points per game, 6 assists. His playoff numbers weren't outstanding, 15 points per game, 5.5 assists. No finals appearances and only 1 All-Star game appearance. He sits at number 73 on the list. Amar'e Stoudemire is next on this list. He played 6 seasons, but only 3 of them were legit. He made 3 All-Star games in this he made 1 All-Star game in this decade, but him and the next guy on this list have the same issue, that they came in the decade on a very high note, and due to injury, they really fell off. 15 points per game, 6 rebounds. Amar'e Stoudemire is 13 on this list. He was supposed to be the guy that was going to be next to Carmelo, and they were going to revitalize, rejuvenate, re-energize New York. And for a short period, they did it. But the problem was that Amar'e couldn't stay healthy, Carmelo couldn't play with his teammates. So Amar'e slips down to 72 on this list, and he's another guy who we're going to remember more fondly for his Phoenix Suns days, and I think that he'll be another one of those guys that when we see the Knicks jersey, we're like, oh yeah, that's right, he played for the Knicks too. Him and Larry Johnson are the 2 dudes who play the same similar position, power forward position, uber athletic, but because of injuries, kind of fall off in a Knicks jersey. Amar'e Stoudemire, 72 on the list. 71, his best years were played in Phoenix and Dallas. He comes to the Lakers in a trade that didn't make a ton of sense at the time, but they thought, hey, Miami has a big 3. We want a big 3. So they paired Dwight Howard and Kobe Bryant next to Steve Nash, who only played 4 seasons this decade, averaged 13 points and 9 assists per game, or 9.6 assists per game. That's the most assists per game this decade. Steve Nash, the back injuries really ended his career prematurely. I thought he had 4 or 5 more years afterwards. He retired before he was 40. That's something that I don't think a ton of people thought was going to happen. I think a lot of people around the league, I thought a lot of fans thought he was going to be playing well into his 40s. Thankfully, he finally got his ring, not as a player, but as a office personnel, as a personality manager almost, for the Golden State Warriors. He was the first guy really to co-sign for Steph Curry. We knew Steph Curry was going to be good, but Steve Nash saying, hey, this is the future, that I think really did it. At 70 on this list, a guy who played for a ton of different teams, but I think we're going to remember him best for playing with the Memphis Grizzlies. He's a dude who we're really sad didn't win a ring, but I think that he is the epitome of grit and grind. It's Zach Randolph. Zach Randolph, people forget, not only knocked off the Spurs when they were a 1 seed in 2011, they were the team that I think most people thought were going to be playing in the finals out of the West, or at least playing in the Western Conference Finals against the Lakers. I think those were the 2 teams people really had chalked up to meet in the Western Conference Finals. But he knocks off the Spurs as the 1 seed. He plays the Spurs in 2013 as the underdog Memphis Grizzlies, and granted, they got swept, but he had a hell of a series. He knocks off the Thunder with Westbrook and Durant. Zebo and those grit grind Grizzlies. Really a team, iconic team that never won a title. And it's a shame, and I think he got his number retired with Memphis. He played 8 years this decade, so that's a good amount of numbers of years. He only made one All-Star game as well, but hell of a player for the Memphis Grizzlies. He's a dude that's a local legend. Like Tony Allen, Mike Conley, Z-Bo, Marc Gasol, guys that are never going to have to buy a beer or brisket in Memphis. At number 69, nice, on the list, it is the guy who got his number retired by the San Antonio Spurs recently. He is a Olympic medalist, gold medalist. He has 4 titles with the San Antonio Spurs, but he won one of those titles in this decade. It's a guy who played most of his career off the bench. He had a weird Hall of Fame debate recently on NBA Twitter. It's Manu Ginobili. Ginobili plays 8 seasons this decade, averages 11 points off the bench. He makes one All-Star game early in the decade, and he was, by all accounts, a player who I think a lot of people thought was going to win or had a chance to win the Finals MVP in 2013 before the Spurs completely fell apart to the Miami Heat. He had a very special year that year, and it showed to me that the Spurs way still worked in this decade. It was a very miraculous kind of run. He is the epitome of the old guy, still got it. He went bald. He kept the bald spot, didn't ever really shave his head. And whether you hated the way that he played the game or loved the way he played the game, you can see his impact on a ton of the guys on this list. Most notably being James Harden. Both lefties, both guys start off the bench. And now I don't think Manu ever could get to the point where Harden got. Harden reinvented the position of shooting guard. He's huge. He's a big guy. I don't think Manu ever could put on those type of weights. But he kept his body healthy, which is something that we don't really see. He had longevity, playing 8 seasons in this decade. Manu Ginobili, number 69 on the list. Last 2 guys for this podcast. A guy that I didn't really respect a ton when I made my original list. Last year when I ranked the best players of this decade, I put this guy last. And was it wrong? Sure. But as I did more research, as I rewatched some more film, he was a very impactful player for a team that people forget about. A guy who got a huge contract with the Lakers, never really played many games for him because of insurance reasons with the Lakers, which is really weird. Made a ton of money playing in the league, and that's really what the end goal is, right? Never made it to an NBA Finals, never made it to an NBA title game, but made 2 All-Star games. It's Luol Deng. Deng gets traded from the Bulls to the Hawks, then goes from the Hawks to the Lakers. And that's really where his story kind of stops. And he still was good enough to play. He could have played for a lot of teams, but the Lakers kept him during those rebuilding years and didn't really play him, so he kind of was just collecting a check and not playing, which, let me say, if somebody paid me money to sit around and not do anything all day, a lot of people would take it. I couldn't do it. I don't know how Luol Deng survived not playing the game he loved, not doing what he loved. He played 8 seasons this decade, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a note here. That the 8, the 9, the 10 seasons this decade really shows us that you can kind of see the peak and the decline of a player. A player usually takes 4 years to peak and about 3 years to decline. So you're looking at 7 years between the peak, or between the rise and the fall, right? And then you can figure out how long their peak is. Usually it's about 4 or 5 years. So you're looking at anywhere between 13 and 14 years in the league. That's about a good number. So when somebody plays 8, 9, 10 years in a decade, you really get to see the rise and fall. Yao Ming playing 1 season, that's kind of rough. Brandon Ingram only playing 4 seasons. Again, you don't really get to tell a ton about a player. But when a guy plays 8 years in the league, you kind of get to see Luol Deng, the formation of his career. And I'll say this about Deng. I was wrong earlier to put him low on the list. He has a very interesting value over replacement at 11.5. His win share is 40, which does a lot for him. When you rank the players, he's not very near the bottom. He had a pretty good offensive win share at 20, defensive win share at 20. Look, he's a guy who isn't going to be remembered as fondly as dudes like Steve Nash or Amari Stoudemire or even really Andrew Bynum. But I think that he was a good player in this league. He was an all-star. He was a role player, but he played his role very well. Last guy we're going to do on this podcast is the MVP of the Big Three League now. Dude that played 8 seasons this decade, averaged 14 points per game, had a true shooting percentage of 53%. His VORP was kind of weird. He's another one of those guys who had a really weird end of his career playing with the Brooklyn Nets. It's Joe Johnson. Joe Johnson was buckets when he played for the Phoenix Suns. He had a very interesting role with the Atlanta Hawks this decade as the small forward shooting guard, a guy that really could knock down the three. But again, weird end of the career, kind of a dude that one season you think, hey, where'd Joe Johnson go? You don't really remember. But my Joe Johnson memory, I think, was the game they played against the Heat in, I think, 2012-ish. And he went off. I think he had like 20-something points, 25, 27 points or something like that. And he just was giving it to Dwayne Wade. And another guy who, you know, when you talk about, hey, can I get a good role player? Can I get a good guy at the end of his career to really come off the bench and make some things happen? Joe Johnson would be that guy. But because he played for the Phoenix Suns, I think if the Suns would have kept him in the late 2000s, they could have been a dynastic team at the beginning of this decade. You might see them winning the title in 2011 instead of the Mavericks. But because he got traded, or they moved off of him, goes to the Hawks. The Hawks, another one of those weird middle teams with Al Horford and Paul Millsap. He's a guy who fondly remembered, very good career, 67 on the list, but he falls in that bottom half of this list. So that's going to do it for this podcast. Tomorrow we're going to do numbers 66 through 51. I'm going to talk about a couple of Hall of Famers. We're going to talk about a couple guys who are going to be in the Hall of Fame one day. And we're going to talk about a couple guys who are going to be in the Hall of Fame very soon. So tomorrow we're going to break that down. And then next week, if we're lucky, we'll get the 2000s. That's going to do it for the show. Tomorrow we're talking television. All you guys in self-distance, quarantine, fighting the coronavirus, fight the good fight, wash your hands. Please, 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 please. I've said this before. Do not go to bars. Don't go to clubs. Try not to go to the beach if you can. I get it if you're young and you're healthy and you think that, hey, this coronavirus is not really going to affect me. It's just a respiratory infection. When I say that it's a legit problem, I mean it. Please wash your hands. Please try not to get other people infected. I'm going to give you another podcast tomorrow. I'll talk to you guys then. Stay safe. Wash your hands.